going to tell you, once a year is when I wear name badges. I hate name badges. If you come to the care center and you are walking around and you see me, I will not have a name badge on. And the only time of the year I wear a name badge is for this conference. I was going to plan very thoughtful, insightful, moving, warming, heart-rendering opening statements. And then I got distracted because there's all these people that I end up giving hugs to as I'm getting ready to talk. So I have like 3 lines on my notes to talk to you this morning, which is really good because I've only got about 5 or so minutes. One thing that was offered to me when I was telling Candace Carr, wherever you are, I told her, she works for Children's Institute here in LA. I said, I don't know what I'm going to say. And she said, read a poem. I thought, what a great idea. I could read a poem. Except for I have no poems to read to you. I also had to look on the brochure for this one to find out what conference that this is. We're 17. And that's when I start getting nostalgic, because there may be a couple of you who, when we had PCIT Conference number 1, which was probably somewhere around 17 years ago, it was a small group of people, maybe 75 people. Sheila Iberg was there, Cheryl McNeil was there, and some other people from PCIT around the country, but it was in Sacramento, a very small group of people. And I don't know that I really thought that this was going to last for 17 years, that we would have this pretty hardcore committed group of people, that's you guys, who would year after year sustain, which I know that you have sustained because I know who you are, and I just gave you hugs when you walked in the door. And it's really nice for me to feel personally, professionally, like I have in some way contributed to what you are doing on a day-to-day basis. I am not going to get sort of heartwarming and thoughtful, but I do want to say that I realized a long time ago that the world we live in is difficult, and especially, and I'm not going to get political, when you think about what goes on at the federal level of our government and in the White House, it's scary things. Even when you think about internationally what goes on. And we don't really have a lot of opportunity to make change at that level. But we do have a lot of opportunity to make change on an everyday basis in a really important and effective way with the families that you see when you go to work, with the families that you see when you do PCIT. I got started in this PCIT thing because it works. Really, quite simply, it works. There was a goodness of fit for me. I used to, in the really old days, be a preschool teacher. And I had this lady who was my instructor teaching me how to be a preschool teacher. She would write notes. I'd go in there in classroom and I'd teach these 3- and 4-year-old kids and just play with them. And she would stand off to the side and she would write notes about what I was doing. Actually, it happened through an observation room, which is also a little weird considering you guys also spend every single, well, not every single day, but probably most of the days during the week in an observation room. So she'd be in this observation room and she'd write on this long legal pad all the things that I did right in working with kids. You should understand that this is in 1974, before a good portion of you were even born. But she would write all the things down that I did right. And it was up to me to sort of read through these things. She would give them to me after that particular preschool day. She'd give them to me. And I had to discern what the things were that I didn't do right. But that was her style. She would write all these things out. She should write like 15 pages on a given morning about me and the other people who were also taking this preschool training class. I still have those legal-sized notes from 20, 30 years ago. And so I realized early on, it wasn't about critical statements. It wasn't about the note on step, quit, or nuts. It was all about how you provide this positive, constructive thing to kids on a consistent basis that helps them to be good human beings. And so that's why PCIT, for me personally, fits. It's an empirically supported treatment. It's a thing that I think is teachable, as evidenced by all of you, but also personally just fits. And so when I think about what we contribute, even what we contribute on a big scale, which is really hard, I do have some degree of, maybe I should say faith, that the things that happen when you are in an observation room and you are seeing change with a particular child, because I know that you have seen that. You have seen a mom who learns how to do something simple as recognize when her child is behaving or sitting still in a chair, or you have generated in that couple a hug, an affection, a pat on the back, a praise, or you have generated in that child that you're providing treatment with a smile, not to you, but a smile to his mom or to her mom. You know what I'm talking about with regard to change. So it really makes me feel good to see you guys here, because I can say these things, you know what the hell I'm talking about. So I really, really appreciate, and I'm still just a little bit shocked that we are PCIT Conference number 17. This is just a really remarkable thing, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm also realizing, as you see behind me, it says this word trauma, because so many of the families that we see, so many of the families that get involved in public mental health, not just have the disruptive behavior things that are related to PCIT, but they also have this issue of trauma. And we'll talk about that with our presenters. We'll talk about that today and tomorrow. I encourage you to share. This is an important time. I really would like for you, as you go through today and tomorrow, whenever the opportunity presents, if you have a question in your hand, in your head, to ask that question, or at least when you walk out of the room, to talk to the person you are sitting next to, or to your friend, who you're the person who drove in a car with to get here, because that is really important too. It's important to hear the information, but it's much more important to do something with it. So I'm here to welcome you today, to thank you for coming, to thank you for bearing the 405 freeway. It's always a difficult thing. And also here to introduce the person who's almost right next to my office, who pretty much every day, I don't go very far unless I say, Susan, is this okay? Also here to introduce Susan Timmer, who's going to introduce our keynote presenter, because they have a personal relationship going back. So what I'd like to do is just really thank you for coming, and also to introduce Susan Timmer.
This is the clicking thing. Oh, Anthony, you were supposed to have this behind you. Anthony wanted to say welcome. So in many languages. That's Anthony's slide. This is my slide. Hi, everybody. It's really great to see you. It's amazing to see you. Yay! Yay! I know. It's really the best part of this conference. It's just seeing people you haven't seen since last year. I love it. So I have some important announcements. Last year, some of our colleagues introduced the idea of moving in PCIT, active play, and I might get this wrong, the move komami, what was that? Anyway, I think Maria, didn't you also do something with movement in play? And we really took this whole idea to heart this year. Number one, I just want to call out the amazing swag bags. This is like our beach ball theme, okay? I know you're wondering, like, what? They kind of look like First 5 LA colors, but okay, we went with the turquoise bags with purple water bottles. This is all to like get things light. We're talking about heavy things here this year. Trauma and treatment and, you know, the hardest things that kids have to deal with. And so to kind of counterbalance that, we wanted to introduce a little beach ball theme and the idea of moving more. So we are introducing a new culture of movement and stretch for physical and mental health in 2017. Doesn't that sound like important? And, you know, hey, our stock price is going to go up double. So whenever in between presentations, feel free to stand up, shake it out, stretch, move around during breaks, and we'll have a couple of little 5-minute, oh, good stretching back there, excellent stretching in the afternoons, instead of like coming back after that afternoon break and feeling like, can I get through this last part of the afternoon without much coffee and possibly cookies? We're going to have 2 5-minute stretch things, one each day, and so we'll see how that goes. You'll let us know, I hope, if it was fun or not. Much planning went into it. That's all I'll say. A couple of other announcements. You might have noticed, if you look on the back of your program, that this very cool advertisement, it says PCIT app launched. I might have gotten a little overexcited on that. Also, a very cool thing was launched that was not the app, but is the app website. So I encourage you all to sign on to that. You'll get notifications of progress, opportunities to contribute to the construction of this app. It's a very awesome thing. And also, we've made it to the big time. Tomorrow, we are going to have a vendor table from CAPSAC, which is the California branch of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. Check out the info they have. They also have some opportunities for dissertation grant support, and they're very cool people. Once again, my favorite part, no, not my favorite part of the conference, but a favorite part is a social reception tonight at 4:30 out on the terrace. It will be 90 degrees, so you can feel free to dump your water bottles over your hydrate. And last but not least, feel free to take a look at this cool thing. But the last thing I want to say is that there is going to be a Spanish Coalition meeting tomorrow morning. The Spanish Coalition is an awesome group that does a lot of stuff for us as a whole, PCIT therapists, PCIT people as a whole. And if you haven't joined this and you're Spanish speaking, or you have in your heart that you want to be Spanish speaking, feel free to go to this meeting tomorrow from 9 to 9:55 in the Northridge room. Okay? Bueno. In my heart, yes. Now it is such an amazing pleasure to Anna's looking at this like, what the heck? Okay, let me just tell you that when you Google important people, very cool images come up. And you click on the thing saying more images for Ann Easterbrooks, and all this stuff comes up with people that she's been associated with over the years. You might know that that's Barry Brazelton, but also in there, Ann, look, there's a picture of Wendy. I know. So, and then various graphs from presentations that she's given. But, it's just sort of a nice way of introducing her. Like when you look up Susan G. Timmer on Google, let me tell you, not interesting at all. Okay. David Duchovny. Yeah, Anne and David Duchovny, long-standing relationship there. Yeah, I don't know the connection, but it's cool that it came up, right? So Anne and I have known each other, it's almost 40 years. And I went to graduate school together. And because I've told you all before, that I have this need for you all to meet the people that I think are tremendously wonderful. Anne is a developmental psychologist, has made huge contributions in the area of social and emotional development of infants and young children. She is also, they didn't have a name for this when we were in graduate school, an applied developmental scientist. I think I'm going to be that too. Yeah, and has done a lot of evaluation of the Healthy Families Massachusetts project, and so has a lot to tell us about trauma and young families and the kinds of challenges that they have. We know a lot of this, but Anne has a kind of view from 10,000 feet up too. Besides that, Anne is a wonderful human being and has mentored generations of graduate students and is a wonderful cook and a good dog trainer too. Now, I'd like you to welcome and give her our good old PCIT welcome.
That's just wonderful. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for the wonderful welcome and for the time we'll share. And if you don't know Susan, you all know Susan Timmer, right? If you don't, you have to, because she's just an incredible person. And you know, I love being here, and this is going to be fantastic. So I want to thank you for the invitation, and I also want to thank all of you for the work that you do on behalf of children and youth and families. I feel like we each have a little bit of the same mission. We're each doing our part, and together it feels to me like we're all part of the same extended family working towards the same goal. So what I'm going to try to do here is what's on my laptop is not exactly what's on the screen, so I'm going to try to do these both together. I want to acknowledge all the people who have contributed to my program, my research, and especially to the families who have participated, who are involved in programs but realize the value of participating in research, and to the services and programs that realize the value of the partnerships that we can have between researchers and practitioners and programs, all for the benefit of children and families. This slide just tells you a little bit about TIER. The Tufts Interdisciplinary Evaluation Research Center is where I am located to do my research. And what I want to say about that is that this is where we do a lot of program evaluations of services and programs that support children and families. And we come at it through several different lenses. It's a collaborative that involves people who are program policymakers, cultural psychologists, applied developmental scientists, and together we are more than each of us individually. Now I'm going to give you a little roadmap to how the presentation will go, or what I hope to do today in the presentation. First, we're going to talk about a couple of operating principles that we will use today. Then we'll talk about stress and trauma, what role they play in human development. Is it a positive role, a negative role? And kind of think about developmental aspects of building a stress regulatory system and a kind of self-regulatory system. So this is not exactly working, right? We can't do that without talking about resilience and resilient functioning and some buzzwords that probably everybody has heard about. I also want to talk about the importance of the narratives that people give to their lives and meaning making and kind of mental representations and how people think about their lives and how we can help them do that and the impact that it has on their participation in programs and what they get from what we have to offer. And then I will share hopefully a little bit about some things that we've learned from our research study, a longitudinal study of young mothers who have participated in a program called Healthy Families Massachusetts, a home visiting based program, and a longitudinal study from pregnancy until the children now are about 8 years old. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the qualitative as well as the quantitative work that we've done. And then finally talk about, share some thoughts about what this means for programs and policies. So operating principle number one is the principle of heterogeneity. And there's this book called The End of Average. Does anybody know about that? It's a recent book by Todd Rose. And it's just saying, you know, we talk about the average person, but there is no average person, right? There's heterogeneity in populations. We tend to categorize people and categorize experiences. That's because it makes it easier for us to think and talk about them. But there's a danger in doing that categorization, that it's really not representing the variety, the heterogeneity within a population. So we could say, well, you know, people in LA, well, people in LA are very different from each other. In the last week, I've heard about, you know, on the East Coast, there's a lot of talk about the hurricanes because you know, the hurricanes are impacting the Caribbean and the East Coast. So, you know, they talk about, well, the people experiencing the hurricanes. Well, people, you know, bring their own experiences and narratives, and communities have various assets. So there's the first operating principle is that of heterogeneity, that two people experience the same or maybe not the same in different ways. The second operating principle is that of resilience. So this is a buzzword. You've all heard the buzzword of resilience. It's used not only in kind of the therapeutic or psychological literature, but in communities, in urban planning, and in environmental ecology. The word resilience has really come up a lot. We also have a tendency, and this relates back to the first operating principle, we have a tendency to think about people as resilient or not, right? This is you hear phrases, this is a resilient person. This is a resilient community. Just recently, in regard to the hurricanes, I heard on the news people talking about, well, Puerto Ricans are a resilient people in response to thinking about the devastation of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. But that really, the way I like to think about resilience, and I often call it resilient functioning, is as a product between kind of what is in the intersection, the co-action of the characteristics and competencies of the person, but also of their environment. So the environment representing the family or the community or the greater society. So we have to think about kind of the dynamic interactions between what the person brings and what the external environment brings. So what does this have to do with trauma? Well, I'm getting to that. And this slide just represents the American Psychological Association's definition of trauma, an emotional response to a terrible event, right? And then the behavior that follows that, the emotions and behaviors that follows that. Well, you know, responding to a traumatic event with negative emotions and certain kinds of behaviors is expected, it's typical, it's normative, and in some ways it's adaptive to that immediate event, right? Where we get into trouble is where people get stuck in certain patterns of behaviors and don't have the flexibility to change that. So a response to trauma is normative and expected, and it's necessary. However, when it disrupts kind of the relationships that people have with themselves, with their family members, with their community, that's when we tend to think about trauma and traumatic responses as being more worrisome. So in our research, we have used the UCLA Child and Adolescent Reaction Index. Does anybody know of that instrument? Okay, it's fitting. Here we are at UCLA. It was developed at UCLA. That asks people to report their trauma history, their history of exposure to certain events that could be traumatic. And this is direct witnessing or hearing about or seeing, learning about something that happened to a close family or friend. And also the UCLA measure looks at various symptoms clusters that represent the behavioral responses, right? So these clusters include things like dissociation or dreaming about the traumatic events, avoidance of stimuli that would make you come into contact or be exposed to that event, altered cognitions, distorted cognitions, or insistence that you can't remember something, and altered arousal and reactivity. So kind of a hypervigilance, being kind of always on guard or really focused, laser focused on whether or not something related to that traumatic event is going to happen, or could be reckless kinds of behavior, irritability, and disturbed concentration and sleep. So these responses that might be typical and appropriate responses at one point in time, if they become embedded and extended, that can be problematic as PTSD. So we can't talk about this without talking about stress. And in the course of the conversation, I'm going to talk about, is stress positive, is it negative, and different people's views on how we think about stress. So in order to understand stress, we have to talk about the kind of development of the stress regulation system. So here's a few more operating principles. What does it mean there is no such thing as an infant? Has anyone heard that phrase before? Anybody? Yes, some people have heard there's no such thing as an infant. This was a term that was used by Donald Winnicott, who was a psychotherapist. And he talked about there's no such thing as an infant because an infant needs a regulatory system provided by a caregiver, right? So an infant doesn't exist on his or her own. In fact, their very survival depends on the presence and the nurturant care of others in their environments. So we each have our own stress regulatory and self-regulatory systems, but we don't develop them on our own. Rather, we develop them in the context of those important relationships from the very beginning. So why do I have this picture up here? Let's see, that's of the fetus. Well, humans are built to adapt to a variety of situations that they come into. So the newborn, when they, exit their mother, they're not finished. Newborns aren't finished. A lot of development happens postnatally. And that is actually a good thing because it allows us to kind of to develop patterns of behavior and systems that fit the particular environment that we're coming into. People talk about this. Have you heard the phrase fetal programming? Anybody heard of fetal programming? So that's the idea that a newborn is going to have an increased chance of survival and of acquiring the specific learning that is necessary or that's going to be most optimally adaptive to their situation that they come into, right? Based on what they have learned as a developing fetus, right? That the environment, it could be maternal stress, it could be the environment of nutrition or smoking, maternal smoking. That prenatal environment influences how that infant is building their stress regulatory system even before birth. Does that make sense to everybody? Right. So fetal programming is one of those terms that people use to talk about, the building of the plane as you're flying it, and you're building it to adapt to the particular environment that the infant expects to get. And this another buzz phrase is called the predictive adaptive response. So we all are, using our brains to predict what's going to happen next, and we do that on the basis of our past and current experiences, right? So the fetus is using the predictive adaptive response to build their kind of stress regulatory system and build their brain in a way that is going to be maximally adapted to the environment that they think they're going to get. And that's a good thing, but maybe not only just a good thing. Okay. So, as I've said before, the stress regulation and the self-regulatory system are something that are developed, are built over time. It's not something that we come with. And self-regulation is another term that's in the kind of the speak right now. And self-regulation is something that builds over the first 5 years or even more, first 5 years of life. But does that mean that then, as Freud said, development is all over by age of 6, right? That was what Freud said, by the age of 6. Well, does that mean that, we hearken to that? Probably not, because otherwise we wouldn't be in this room together, right? Thinking about how to help, people take advantage and to make changes as they get older. So there are certain life transitions that present more opportunities for reorganization, for growth. Some of you might know the work of Emmy Werner, who did a wonderful longitudinal study in Hawaii, where she followed people, from childhood well into their 40s. And she talked about certain particular points in development that were really maximal opportunities. And some of them that she pointed out were things like graduating from high school. You know, what's next? Whether you're going to a job or whether you're going to higher education, it might be an opportunity to kind of reinvent yourself, to kind of construct a different narrative or to be part of a different community. Parenthood certainly is one of those opportunities for reorganization that many, many people talk about. So the opportunity to kind of do things a different way or as a catalyst for growth. But we also have to think about what are the community, the family, and the societal contexts in which these things are taking place. So different communities provide different assets and resources, for example, intervention programs that can be used. And then different people have experiences of marginalization or oppression or of opportunities that we need to think about. So it's really the kind of what the individual brings, again, and what the kind of community, what the ecology brings as well. So let's talk more about the, if I can catch up here, the stress regulatory system. So hopefully right now, your parasympathetic system is activated, right? What happens with the parasympathetic system? It's a state where you're pretty calm and relaxed. You're open to new learning, right? Your prefrontal cortex is working to control all those things that have to do with planning and organization and higher order learning. And so that's what this graph represents is the relationship between arousal, kind of how aroused we are, and performance. So there, at low levels of arousal, we're probably still lying in bed, right? So you need kind of a moderate amount of stress to see the, the best performance. So as arousal gets higher, performance is at its highest peak, right? But think about it, as we get more and more aroused by the levels of the stressors in the environment, then performance decreases because we're thinking about those things. Is this a dangerous situation? Right? What's going on here? And so that's at this point, which is called the regulatory switch or the switch point. There, the body turns from the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system to the sympathetic nervous system. What happens there? Your hands are sweating. Your feet might be sweating. What's happening to your heart? Your heart's racing. Your attention is really focused, right? The sympathetic nervous system is preparing the body for that fight or flight response, right? Getting ready. And it's important and it's really necessary. But what happens at that point, at this point of the regulatory switch from the parasympathetic to the sympathetic nervous system, is that those aspects of the prefrontal cortex that have to do with things, here's another buzz phrase, executive function, right? Of long-term planning, of impulse control, of working memory. Those go offline. And the parts of the brain and the body that have to do with survival and get me out of the situation or those kinds of things, the fight or flight, come online. So that challenges people's emotion regulation. It challenges kind of the learning of new things. And each of us will have a different place on this arousal level where our switch point, our regulatory switch happens. So think of the implications for a child who can tolerate a lower level of arousal before they switch from the prefrontal cortex, they're organized, they're learning, they're kind of regulated, to the posterior cortex, which is kind of doing those behaviors that are self-protective kind of emergency behaviors, right? So if they can only tolerate this level of arousal, their switch point is right here. And they're spending a lot less time in that area where the prefrontal cortex is activated. Does that make sense? Can you think about how that would relate to your practice, just for children or for adults? It's not only for children. All right, so you've probably seen this. Stress comes in several forms. We talk about positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. Toxic stress is when our systems become overloaded and overwhelmed, and we're no longer able to mount an appropriate, an adaptive stress response. An adaptive stress response would be one that gets your body ready to meet that emergency, but also is able to down-regulate it when the emergency is done, recognizing those cues that turn off the system and get back to that kind of calm level where learning and self-regulation and impulse control can happen. So arousal, at the kind of when toxic stress is happening, arousal stays high. These tend to be situations where there is repeated and prolonged exposure to chronic stressors. And for a child, importantly, there aren't the adults in that context that can help them regulate themselves. Because remember, they can't do it themselves at the beginning, right? So the toxic stress involves kind of acute or highly chronic stressors in the absence of a nurturing caregiver who can help that child kind of get themselves together, re-regulate, and then get back to the business of learning and play and being a child. Tolerable stress tends to be those stressors that maybe are not so intense, but they're less intense, but they're made tolerable because there is the other to kind of help co-regulate the environment for them. And we'll talk about this idea of positive stress in a little bit. So, how do early experiences of trauma kind of stick around and become embedded in the body and actually have implications, negative implications for adult health and mental health and kind of functioning within relationships? So we know that our experiences create, activate our regulatory systems. You've heard of cortisol, right? Cortisol is an operating hormone that is important for mounting a stress response. If you think about cortisol as fluctuating throughout the day and night, cortisol levels go down at night when you go to sleep, but they start to rise, and it's important, and that's in part what gets you out of bed in the morning, right? You need that kind of ebb and flow of the cortisol response to kind of be able to get down, regulate, and then to actually get yourself up for the day at the same time. But elevated cortisol, what happens in cases of trauma is that cortisol is activated, it's elevated, and it remains at an elevated level. It's not turned off, right? And we know that elevated levels of cortisol circulating in the brain can be neurotoxic to developing brains. So it's important to have it. It's also important to have a system that will down-regulate it and turn it off. And stress response also is involved in the hippocampus, which is related to executive function. So those things about working memory, about having cognitive flexibility and impulse control. So what do we think about intergenerational transmission of trauma then? Prenatal and postnatal experiences and exposure to stressful experiences can be transmitted from generation to generation, and it can be done so through behavioral kind of markers of parenting. People talk about emotionally unavailable parenting being related to a parent having experienced traumatic events in their own childhood or current traumatic events, exhibiting frightening or frightened behavior, or withdrawn, kind of unavailable parenting. And people also are increasingly talking about this phenomenon of epigenetics. So is that another word that you've heard? Epigenetics? Okay. So it has to do with the ways in which our experiences actually modify how and whether the genes are turned off, turned on, expressed, and at different times in a person's life. So our experiences that we have can actually not affect the genetic code, but they affect whether or not a gene is expressed. That's kind of what epigenetics refers to. One caveat, one kind of question mark about this, or something to note, is that most of the research on epigenetics still currently, and because, in part because of ethical implications, is still at the level of non-humans and non-human primates. So we're still learning about what this means, but there are some data that look at kind of epigenetic effects in humans. Okay, so the ghosts in the nursery. Everyone heard of the ghosts in the nursery? So this is a phrase that was written by Selma Freiberg and her colleagues, saying, you know, in every nursery there are ghosts. In some families, they've taken up residence in the nursery, claiming tradition and rights of ownership, and they've been present at the christening for 2 or more generations. Just a metaphor for reflecting that trauma can become intergenerational trauma through parenting. We parent in part by how we were parented. So in the attachment literature, John Bowlby talked about internal working models of attachment and of relationships, that as you're being parented, you're also simultaneously learning, you know, about yourself, you're learning about your partner, and you're also learning how relationships work. You're not just learning your piece of it, you're learning kind of the whole of it. And we tend to recreate. We don't have to, it's not necessarily the case, but we tend to, you know, become parents, and we learn things from our experiences. This is important because even from the moment of birth and even before, the caregiver is the external regulator for that child who can't do it on their own. So why in most cultures is the infant, you know, even before the cord is cut, placed on the mother's chest? Do you have ideas? Attachment, it's a mechanism of attachment perhaps. It's even a basic biological, physiological thing. Newborns can't regulate their body temperature, and that's a dangerous thing. So think about it. If you're skin to skin with somebody, you're getting your temperature, that baby's temperature is being regulated in part by that other body, by that mother. So we think about the caregiver at first as the physiological regulator, and then they help that growing child to regulate their emotions, to become their emotion regulator. So let's see. Oh, and this is just the reference to the Freiberg work. Now, is stress always a bad thing, right? So, right, the desserts, right? Stressed is dessert spelled backwards. And maybe, hey, chocolate desserts even, you know, have some beneficial effect on stress. So let's talk a little bit about how stress might be positive. And I like to think about the work here of Ed Tronick, who was an infant psychologist. And he talks about kind of the inherent stressors of everyday daily life as being really important because they kind of, and he talks about it for an infant, but they help that infant to kind of develop that coping muscle, right? That's not a good way of putting it, but, practice makes that muscle better, right? So these little stressors of, how do I get my thumb to my mouth? How do I get myself to sleep? How do I communicate to my caregiver exactly what I want them to know? These normal, typical, inherent stressors of daily life might be considered to be positive stress because they help then kind of gradually build a robust stress regulation system that can be used later on for coping with bigger stressors, right? And then with later, potentially with later traumatic experiences. But again, the infant's not doing this on their own. The caregiver is really important, but the idea is that positive stress can be a catalyst for positive growth. Have you had Bruce Perry come to talk to this conference? Not yet? Not yet? So, Bruce Perry is another person who, has done a lot of the early work on stress and the impact of stress on young children. So you might want to invite him to come to the conference. Yeah. So here's another word, resilience. Is that in your practices now? Yeah, right, okay. So we need to talk about what resilience means and what it doesn't mean. And there are many definitions of resilience. And what it certainly doesn't mean is that it's a static trait or a property of the individual. It does not mean that, because no one person is resilient to and invulnerable to any and all contexts. There was a book written years ago called The Invulnerable Child, which I never liked it, and now I know why I never liked it, the title, because no person is invulnerable to everything. So what do I like about this particular definition? This is from Anne Maston, who wrote a book. I would encourage you to look at the book if you're really interested in this area. Wrote a book called Ordinary Magic. She's talking about resilience processes as ordinary magic. They're not extraordinary. They're things that are everyday possibilities. The thing that I like to take from this definition is kind of the dynamic system. Resilience is dynamic. It's not static. Okay, here's another one. This one by Michael Rudder. So I hear a baby. Is that Luca? Yeah, in the background. He's welcome to share his thoughts about this talk. So what I like about this, the second definition, is the phrase relatively good outcome. Because resilient, to say that someone is showing resilient functioning does not imply that they have to be Superwoman, Wonder Woman, Superman, whatever. It's relatively good functioning, not doesn't have to be, the A+. And then what I like from the final definition here by Michael Unger, who is a social worker, is that it talks about not only the capacity of individuals to navigate their way to resources, because that's important, like thinking about personal agency, right? But also the capacity of the ecologies to provide the resources, right? What's available in the environment that is possible. And to do that in ways that are meaningful, culturally meaningful ways to be shared. Right. So I like to take pieces of all these definitions of resilience. And to think about resilience as not a property of a person or a community, but as a co-action kind of somewhere in the relation between these, between people and their contexts. So let's talk a little bit about characteristics of resilience in people and contexts. And I'll just focus on a couple that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, which is meaning making. We all make meanings of our experiences. So they don't just happen to us, but we understand them in our own particular ways. And also, talking about opportunities. And opportunities, I'm thinking here about the provision of programs and opportunities for interventions. So, is resilience just a matter of mind over matter, right? Does what you believe about stress affect how you respond to stress? So how many of you, anybody, has seen a TED Talk called How to Make Stress Your Friend? Okay, a few people have. I mean, it makes you feel pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah. So this is a TED Talk. It's one of the top 20 TED Talks, so it might be something that you want to look at, by Kelly McGonigal, and she is a health psychologist who happens to be at Stanford Business School, which is interesting. And so she said she spent her first 10 or so years in her academic life telling people how bad stress is for you, right? So the mindset that stress is a bad thing, we have to get rid of stress. She said, I wish I hadn't done that, because what you believe about stress affects how you respond to it. That's what she says now. So by reshaping how you think about stress, you can retool your body's response to stress. It's the meaning, it's a narrative that we apply. So she says the next time you're stressed, think about it as your body preparing you for the challenge. Well, that in part is good, right? So you think about my body is getting ready. I'm going to be able to mount that response that I need. And she talks, okay, so we talked a little bit about cortisol as a stress hormone, but she also talks about oxytocin, which some people, name the love drug, right? Or some people talk about as the social bonding hormone. She said this is a neglected, people neglect to talk about this as a normative, typical part of the stress response, that we also activate oxytocin. And what that does in the stress response, oxytocin as being a hormone that facilitates connections between people, is that brings us closer to the people who can support us, right? It's activated, it's important in social support and in being part of therapeutic relationships with other people. So it's interesting to think about oxytocin in this way, and then we can also think about how it might be used in interventions. I think, however, there is some danger in going too far down this road, because I don't want people to think then that if you don't think that stress is good for you, that it's kind of a blaming the victim kind of thing, or blaming the person. So I think that there are some limitations to this, particularly in cases of really serious traumatic exposure and toxic stress. But I still would encourage you to look at the website and the TED Talk, and there's the URL for it. So there is some evidence that, other evidence that there's something important going on here. And I just report one study that was looking at adolescents, and they found that their beliefs about stress, whether stress is bad for you, whether it can possibly be enhancing, affected how they responded to adverse events, and then how they kind of regulated or controlled their impulses. So, this particular study confirms some of what McGonigal is proposing. But again, these were not kind of toxic stressors that they were talking about. Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit, just a teeny bit, about a longitudinal study that I've been involved in for many years. We call it the Massachusetts Healthy Families Evaluation. It's an evaluation of a Healthy Families home visiting, paraprofessional home visiting support program and coaching program for first-time young parents, 20 and younger, having their first child. And it's available throughout the state of Massachusetts. It's a universally available program. Massachusetts is a much smaller state than California. So I don't know whether you have these kinds of universal programs available to everybody. But these are services that are offered from pregnancy, or a mom could come in up until her child's first birthday, and the services would be available until the child turns 3 years old. And they involve home visits, but also connections and referrals to other resources, and center-based visits, and phone call check-ins, lots of different kinds of services. We have been involved with the Children's Trust Massachusetts, which is the agency that administers the program, for many years. And the most recent iteration, they asked us to conduct a randomized controlled trial of the program, which I won't go into kind of how we worked very hard to convince them. We didn't want to do a randomized controlled trial, but they said this is how, this is the gold star of how the National Institutes of Health thinks about that as an evidence-based program. So that's how we went. And thankfully, it turned out well. I don't want you to look at this slide other than to show you that, for this kind of longitudinal research, it was a relatively large sample of 700 mothers who agreed to allow us access to their state agency data, and the agencies allowed that as well. So we have data from the Child Protective Services, from the Department of Education. So we have information about, high school and college attendance and graduation, Department of Public Health, and Department of Transitional Assistance, so welfare and other kinds of entitlements. And we did multiple phone calls with the moms and went across the state again. You can get from one side of Massachusetts to the other in about 4 hours, so it's not like California. So we did home visits over the years, basically from the time of pregnancy until the children. At the most, the 6th wave of data collection, which we just completed last year, the children were about 7 or 8 years old. And we're going to continue seeing some of them for quite a while. This just represents, it's a relatively diverse population, which actually represents the young mother population in the state of Massachusetts. And when they came in, you can also see that this is a population where there's been a lot of traumatic exposure even before they become a young parent. So I just finished writing a chapter on adolescent parenthood, and we challenged the kind of thinking about that, because most of the conditions, the circumstances that are associated with people talking about unfortunate outcomes of being an adolescent, a child of an adolescent parent, actually are things that preceded the adolescent pregnancy in the first place. So attributing causality, sometimes is misplaced. So you can see that most of them, these mothers had traumatic exposure of maltreatment as children. Many of them at the entrance to the study and to receiving services were depressed. There was a lot of residential mobility and a lot of intimate partner violence and PTSD. We found both that evidence for intergenerational transmission of a history of violence. Interestingly, the most overwhelming nature of the CPS records was neglect, not physical abuse. And that's actually not surprising. But we also found evidence of the importance of the buffering effects of nurturant care, even in the presence of a history of trauma and violence, that having memories and being kind of making meaning of early one's childhood history as saying, yes, there were people who were benevolent providers as well, was really important. And most mothers who had early childhood maltreatment experiences broke the cycle of maltreatment. That's something that's typically the case, but it often doesn't get enough airplay. And importantly, Healthy Families, the program, reduced the risk by a substantial margin of repeat maltreatment recurrence. So just going to share some words from some of the moms in the study. And this one is reflecting on the opportunity for a parenthood, transition to parenthood as being an opportunity for and a catalyst for a kind of remaking of the self. She said, I have a lot of responsibility. I was really lazy, and I wouldn't even care about school or anything. When I found out I was pregnant, I said, I need to graduate. I got back to school, I graduated, and I started working. and I feel now like an adult more than a teenager. So she's talking about kind of taking on a new self and the behaviors that go with that. We asked moms to reflect on how their life had changed. And interestingly, some parents said, I'm the same person. My life hasn't changed since becoming a parent. And a little bit later, I'll share something about that. But this mom said, totally, totally different. Everything is different now. And now I see where my mother's coming from, and I can relate. I respect my mother now. And she says, it's not just you anymore. It's whatever you do, how it will inflict upon her, meaning the child. So she's now thinking about kind of that intergenerational thing. I don't know that I have time to talk about some of these last things, but one of our doctoral students, Melissa Colon, is doing a small qualitative study where she's interviewing a sample of young women who were Puerto Rican, and through a methodology called testimonio, which is a methodological approach that asks them to share their voice, talk about their stories and experiences, and also reflect on, it also involves critical race feminist theory, I don't know if you can see that, but also to reflect on their experiences of marginalization. So putting their experiences in a cultural and societal and political context. I'll just share this one. So Melissa came back from her visit with this mom, and she wrote this little memo. She said, you know, Kiana, this is not the name of the mom, but that's what we've given her. Her apartment was stunning, large bay windows, pristine white crown moldings, onyx floors. It sounds like a really nice place, right? Different from the homes I visited in the past few months. But it was empty, except for several dingy plastic bins filled with clothes, our bodies, and brilliant sunlight. And the mom, Kiana, explained to me how she got this apartment, right? She was at the court. A judge had denied her custody of her 2 young children, in part because she didn't have a stable place for them to live. And she was out in the corridor, she was sobbing, and a stranger, you know, a benevolent stranger, approached her and, you know, kind of asked her how she was doing and told her about these apartments that were available. And this woman, Kiana, you know, kind of taking the reins and kind of had the self-agency to call right then. She did the paperwork, and she you know, negotiated this apartment in this beautiful new building. What this reflects is not only Kiana's agency, but also the opportunities that are provided in the context. There was affordable housing available, right? And the stranger kind of told her how to do that. So I'm going to go to this, I think. So all of you know about evidence-based programs. You're participating in one, PCIT. There are a whole plethora of evidence-based programs that support parents and young children and on the road to thriving. And here are a couple of others. But some of that you might, so I'm maybe bringing you a little bit of information that you might not know about, which are some of these kind of epigenetic kinds of interventions that are kind of in the works right now. And the caution mark is that, again, most of the work, not all of it, but most of it has to do with non-human animal models. So there's going to be some translation work to do. But oxytocin has been used now to kind of help reverse the effects of low maternal care. So that's one kind of study. There are other studies that look at the use of probiotics to you know, increase the flora and good flora in the gut microbiome. And I was just talking with one of my former students who's now at UCLA and working in a lab with autism, and she knows about some of this work because a lot of it has been applied to the case of autism. And then there are, you know, some studies that look at kind of an infusion of particular micronutrients post-trauma. And one of these studies that I refer to here is a study that was done in New Zealand post the 2011 earthquake. So I just think these are kind of interesting parallels to working towards the same goal of supporting and providing for children and families. I'm going to go past this right here and just say a couple words about how people engage in programs. So the question of if we build it, if we offer a program, will they come? And will they keep coming back? And will they stay for the entirety of what we think is the right or the best program dosage, right? Because in your programs, does everyone complete the entire program? No. I mean, sometimes maybe if they're mandated, court mandated, but you know, people generally don't. One thing I want to raise is whether or not this is necessarily a bad thing. This is what we're thinking about in our own work, that moms who drop out of the program, it's not necessarily suggesting a treatment failure. It might be that for that person, they got what they needed and they're ready to go on and move on in their life. And that, you know, we all have very busy lives. And so maybe they've gotten the catalyst for what they need. So kind of reframing how we think maybe about people leaving the program, quote unquote, early. Maybe I won't even talk about that. So what are some ideas for policies and for programs? I think it's important to recognize that parents' beliefs affect how they engage in programs and whether or not they stay in the program and their retention in the programs. And that parents, the last slide talked about a study, one of my former doctoral students, Annie Wattups, who looked at parents' beliefs about how one learns to be a parent and whether you can benefit by that, and that people who believe that you can learn to be a parent and get better step by step are more likely to remain and to be retained in intervention programs than those who think actually your parenting is intuitive, you're either a good parent or you're not, and you're born that way. Mothers' histories of trauma affect program impact. And that sometimes programs have difficulty getting traction, getting in the door, people who have certain traumatic experiences, particularly if they are relational kinds of traumas. That providers need support and training in working with trauma-exposed clients. And the World Association for Infant Mental Health is a large global organization, and many states in the U.S. have state affiliates. I think California has one, and maybe some of you are part of that, but I think it's the California Center for Infant, Family, and Early Childhood Mental Health. You would know better than I, but that might be a vehicle for other kinds of training opportunities. And so I'm not going to recap. I'm just going to end now and say that thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you, Susan, especially, and also thank you for the work that you do.
I'm really glad to see everybody standing up, moving around. This is a really excellent group and adopting the culture of movement. Excelente. I'm enormously excited about all of our presenters, okay? Fair warning. But it's only because our presenters are awesome. It is my huge pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Isaiah Pickens, who is Assistant Director of Services at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I'm going to say it wrong, but it's the center at UCLA. And we, Lindsay, Deanna, Brandy Hawk, and I had the great pleasure of listening to him speak at the All Network Conference that the SAMHSA group had in April, and were blown away, okay? Because he has a message that's really important for all of us to listen to. He talks about health disparities and racial discrimination. And, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as the normal group. And if we're not bothered by something, it's hard to imagine how other people feel getting up in the morning and greeting the world. And understanding that world might be hostile to them and what effect that has on people. And Dr. Pickens has done a lot of different things. Hopefully he'll talk a little bit more about it. He has also does a lot of training across the nation and has founded eye-opening enterprises, which is super cool. And I don't want to take any more away from his time than I already have, and mostly just to blabber up here while you guys get seated and get comfortable and so forth. But please welcome Dr. Isaiah Pickens in your best PCIT way.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right. Is this on? Is the lavalier on? First of all, thank you guys for having me. I had a good chuckle. I think Lindsay and crew literally rated my complete Instagram and Twitter. I thought it was an obituary for me at first. I was like, did I die? Did I die? This is great. I really appreciate it, this opening. I am really excited, and just so I make sure I get this right, it's the green button. There we go. You don't have to watch me the whole time. Let's watch this. I am really excited to be here today with you and to talk with you about not just individual and dyadic therapy, but more so, how do we understand some of these things in context? And so I want to start by sharing a story with you. I want you to imagine being in a beautiful city. And in this beautiful city, you're seeing the city skyscrapers, you're seeing the skyline. And as you're dreaming and looking up at this beautiful city, you see something whiz past you, and you realize it's a rock. And you see the rock was thrown by a group of people in ski masks who are dressed in all black. And that rock is being thrown at police officers. And out of all of the mayhem that's going on, you see a person in a yellow shirt coming through like a streak of light, searching all the people in ski masks, and then finally finding one of them and ripping off that ski mask, and then proceeding to beat the crap out of him because that's her son, who is there throwing rocks at police officers. And for those who can picture this, I want you to think about how you might respond as an observer or someone who has seen or heard this. Would your first reaction be to investigate her for abuse? She's hitting her son. She's saying some words that can't be repeated right here about her son throwing these rocks. Would you applaud her for her brave parenting, for taking that kid who thought he could just throw rocks at police and made sure he knew what he should do? Or thirdly, I think we'll all agree with this, you give her a VH1 reality series and just say, look, we just want to see this all the time. Like, we just want to see this all the time. So anyone who follows the news knows that I'm talking about Toya Graham from Baltimore, who was called Hero Mom. And there was a great debate in our country about was how she parented what was the best way to deal with her son, who obviously was frustrated, a young black man who had witnessed what had happened with Freddie Gray in Baltimore and was upset and wanted to do something about it, but being on the street, putting himself at risk. And I want to use Toya Graham and her son, Michael Singleton, as a point of reference for us as we talk about dealing with parent and child interactions, particularly in the context of their community. What we know, though, about Toya Graham is that she was doing pretty much what any parent does. She was trying to keep her child safe. She was trying to protect her child. And when we talk about this concept of safety, one of the things that immediately comes to mind, of course, is our physical safety. Being able to keep weapons away from us, being able to keep doors locked so that people don't get in. But that's only one form of safety. Another very important form of safety is psychological safety. And psychological safety focuses on this ability for an individual to feel like they have the resources to manage the stress that's happening around them, or they can reach out to someone else to help them manage those stressors. And I loved what Dr. Easterbrooks was talking about earlier in terms of being able to understand stress from all these different perspectives. And one of the things she highlighted that I think we need to know is that stress is normal and that our bodies respond automatically, right? And so when we are experiencing stress, we have a stress response that is activated. This is our sympathetic nervous system, and we have different things that start to activate to automatically protect us that represent this fight, flight, or freeze response. You can see some things here. Your temperature might fluctuate. Your heartbeat increases. I was doing a training last week, actually in St. Louis, and with everything going on there, and one of the gentlemen in the audience said his stress response is that he gets bubble guts. I just asked him not to get stressed because I'm not trying to, it's some digestion issues. But people have different issues that come up when they start to feel stressed. And what we know is that we find safety in our relationships. Let's think about when we're first born, infants, how our parents help us to feel safe. Well, Eric Erickson, one of the trailblazing psychoanalysts, says that we have a conflict at every stage in life. And at the first stage in life, our conflict is trust versus mistrust. And the way that we resolve this conflict is when our parents or caregiver, whoever's taking care of us, allows us to feel that those needs are being met to build trust. So our basic needs, like being fed and being held and cuddled when we start to feel overwhelmed. And this is so important because what it does is also set the foundation for secure attachments. And we know that secure attachment is important because what it does is it gives young people a safe base to be able to explore the world. The idea isn't that they're always connected with their caregiver, but they know they have a safe place to go back to be protected so they can explore the world and understand it in their own right. And what we know in terms of finding safety in relationship, that this is, like Dr. Easterbrook pointed out, both kind of a psychological experience where there's the expectation that parents will protect a kid and that there will be support. We see examples of that, like the still face experiment, where the child has the expectation that there will be this back and forth, this co-regulation that occurs between the caregiver and the kid to help them manage when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. But there's also an important piece of the stress response that relates to really connecting and feeling connected to the caregiver physiologically. If we look back at some of the classic studies with Harry Harlow and his monkeys, right? For those who are familiar with those studies, it looked at monkeys who were stressed out. They caused these monkeys to get stressed, and then they gave them either a wire monkey or a monkey that doll that had fur to it. And when they felt stressed out, these monkeys always tended to go to the monkey that had the warm fur on it, because part of, again, what Dr. Easterbrook talked about, this aspect of oxytocin, and also we know this concept of tend and befriend, how we connect with people when we feel stressed out, is so important. Now, the reason why all of these pieces that I'm talking about are so important is in order for us to know and understand trauma in context and understand how we deal with trauma, we have to understand normal development and how these foundational principles are put in place and how they can be undermined by traumatic experiences. So I want to talk a little bit more about Toya Graham. We had a chance to see Toya Graham handle her business and try to get her son back in line. But let's talk a little bit about Toya Graham's experience. Toya Graham grew up in a neighborhood that's probably similar to neighborhoods of kids that you serve, that you deal with, that have potentially a lot of crime. And this caused stress. And with this stress came a tremendous amount of responsibility. In 1996, her mom died, and she really spiraled out of control. And when this happened, her brother says she went into a deep depression and she started abusing substances. Y'all know where this is going. And so as she started abusing these substances, she also had 4 kids. And of course, one of her kids was Michael Singleton. And this was a young black man in Baltimore who, at the time, of course, within the community, there was this awareness of how police and community connect. But then And, about 3 or 4 years, 2 years before Freddie Gray, we had Trayvon Martin, and it became a part of our national conversation. And I'm sure heightened the anxiety of any parent who had a son of color in particular. And so that stress, I wonder what it did to her. Oh, it always gets me. It always gets me. Just so you know, that was a masculine. Oh, very masculine. I did that and I did that in a room of police officers one time. Oh, you better. But I want you to think about how you felt for those 10 seconds, right? You felt anxiety, right? You felt nervous. You felt helpless. Like you couldn't do anything. You're like, what is he doing? I can't stop it. There's nothing I can do about it, right? And all of that was what you felt for that moment. Imagine carrying that every day of your life, starting from when you're a kid with these traumatic experiences, these adverse childhood experiences that you're experiencing, and then carrying it over as a parent, worrying about your child, worrying about will they make it home, and holding on to it. The Toya Graham we saw was the one who was exploding at that moment. But there was so much that was putting pressure into that was blowing into that explosion that was happening that we don't acknowledge many times in the work that we do. And so I want to break that down a little bit for us in terms of how we understand that in context. So at this point, I think everyone is familiar with ACEs, right? Raise your hand if you're not familiar with ACEs. We'll escort you out. No, I'm joking. So ACEs is, the seminal study that was done by Dr. Felitti and Dr. Ande at the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, where they looked at over 17,000 patients who were coming in to get their physicals, but they wanted to look at how did their past adverse childhood experiences impact their future health outcomes. And they looked at 9 different types of experiences that they had, and they found a lot of information related to how these experiences unfolded for people and how it impacted high-risk behavior. But here's the thing, and here's a big limitation of this study that sometimes we don't fully appreciate. The 17,000 people, majority were white, middle-class, suburban patients. And so this obviously wasn't a representative sample of the nation as a whole. So in 2012, there was a mission to create what they called an urban ACEs study. And what this did is they went into Philadelphia and they surveyed over 1,800 people who were a representative sample of that community. So about 44% African American, 44% white. They had Hispanic in there as well. And so really trying to get a better sense of how do ACEs show up as a whole. But the other thing that we know about the original ACEs study is it didn't include things that are more prevalent in urban communities. So 5 new ACEs were added to this urban ACEs study that focused on racism, that focused on poverty, that focused on bullying, and a couple of other areas that particularly are prevalent among urban communities to get an idea of the context that this plays in how they understand themselves. And what they found was staggering. So what you're looking out at in front of you is the comparison between the original ACE study and the urban ACE study. And what they found was that in every single category within the urban ACE study, there was higher percentages of what people experience. So if you look at physical abuse, 35% in the urban ACE study, 28.3% in the original study. If you look at emotional abuse, 3 times as much experience of emotional abuse in the urban ACE study. If you look at incarceration, nearly 3 times as many of the individuals were incarcerated or their parents were incarcerated while they were growing up. And the reason why this is so important is that we understand that complex trauma or multiple traumatic experiences can have a cumulative impact on how someone responds to the world and how they really manage the stress that's around them. With the more traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences or toxic stress, whatever you want to call it, the more that they're experiencing, the more likely it is that they will have some maladaptive functioning, that they will have some difficulty managing even minor stressors in their environment. And so this is one piece of the puzzle for understanding how do we really think about this in context. But this isn't the entire piece of the puzzle. Kenneth Hardy is a researcher who wrote a book called Teens Who Hurt, and I would encourage you to read it if you ever have the chance. But what he talks about are the invisible wounds that shape how we deal with the world around us and help us navigate our world. Again, part of what our goal is to find meaning and also to keep ourselves safe. And in doing that, you have to use the information that's around you to be able to manage that and get there. And so this is a visual that many people use when they talk about culture and understanding culture. And of course, culture goes way beyond just race and ethnicity. It goes into our gender. It goes into our education, our class. All these different aspects make up culture and our identities. But often what we see is what's on the surface. So Toya Graham, she was a black woman who seemed to be really upset with her son, wanting to protect her son, however you wanted to perceive it. But what we saw was the visible, those things that were on the outside. But what was harder to really take and really uncover was what was driving those things. What were the values? What were the beliefs? What were the implicit ideas around how to deal with their world around them? And so as we talk about trauma, part of what we have to do in our field is get beyond talking about individual traumas and look at how trauma has impacts across generations. So this intergenerational trauma that Dr. Easterbrook mentioned earlier really speaks to this transmission and impact of trauma that can happen across generations and really occur in ways that are both explicit, where you can clearly see how it's playing out, or in ways that are implicit. And the thing that we have to understand about any of these traumatic experiences is that, yes, there's the pathology of it. There's how it can negatively impact the way you see the world, the way you manage the world, but there's also the resilience of it and how people find the way to survive. And so we're going to talk about that as we go throughout today's talk, but I want to highlight for this intergenerational trauma that a big part of what can happen is that there's unresolved issues that parents are dealing with that show up with their children and even with how they interact with other people in their lives and community, that really, without an understanding of how this original trauma has impacted them, we don't fully understand why they are parenting the way that they parent. I used to work at a HIV clinic, and I worked with a lot of mothers, and it was a Latino community, and many of the mothers who I worked with had been molested or raped by a family member, by a uncle or a cousin. And it's not necessarily how they contracted the disease, but it was something that was a big part of their background. And what we found out just working there, and research has confirmed some of these things, is that the way that these mothers parented their daughters at times put them at greater risk for the same thing that they had experienced. So in order for what their thinking was, if I had a boyfriend who could have stood up to my cousin or my uncle, then this wouldn't have happened. And the way that kind of boyfriend is someone who's in a gang. That's someone who, has a weapon, who can protect me in this way. And so now the mother may be encouraging the daughter to date someone because this guy can protect you from those things out there, when in fact he's putting them at greater risk. And that trauma that she has experienced has shaped the way she sees her connection with her daughter and how she sees herself protecting her daughter and really helping her manage the world and its dangers and its threat. So that's one piece of intergenerational trauma in terms of influencing the way a parent parents their child. But this isn't the only piece that we should understand in context. The other piece of this that we should really understand is historical trauma. And historical trauma refers to these cumulative emotional and psychological woundings that a person has and that impacts a generation and really the way that they experience and see each other. So, when we talk about the United States, there are a number of historical traumas we can reference. Of course, we can talk about slavery of African Americans. We can talk about displacement and genocide of Native Americans. We can talk about Japanese internment. If we go outside of the United States, we could talk about the Holocaust. And here's what all of these events do, and this is what research has shown. Part of what these events do is they create a public narrative that the community sees themselves and how they figure to navigate being safe within the mainstream society. And so the messages that are passed down from generation to generation come based on the history of their experiences and the history of some of these traumas. And so when you see, when we talk about a parent who might tell their child, I don't want you to talk to the school counselor. I thank you for the beat. I'm going to just bounce to it. But part of when we look at a situation, again, looking beyond the surface, looking at some of these invisible wounds, and a parent says, don't talk to that school counselor. I don't want you to tell them anything. And we see, a disengaged parent or a defiant parent or an oppositional kid, when in actuality, their experience in this country has been whenever you've worked with the system has found a way to break apart the family. The system hasn't been in place to support sustaining our family or even understanding why we are afraid in the first place. And so being able to understand these historical aspects of the experience and understand the public narrative, the narrative that a community thinks about themselves and what they pass down, can go a long way to informing how we engage these communities. And then on the flip side of this, I said it's both kind of this psychopathology that occurs, but it's also this resilience. Research has shown time and time again that when a community has a strong, or an individual has a strong sense of cultural heritage, the messages that they have for themselves is that we've struggled and we survived. We've moved forward, that we're a strong people. That has actually fostered greater levels of resilience. And so that narrative is so important because it's the story people tell themselves about how to navigate the world safely and to find meaning in the world. And so I want to dig a little bit deeper into this before we talk about some of the solutions around some of these things. Now, part of what's happening is that when people experience trauma, particularly early in life and particularly community traumas, this can create a disconnect, and it can lead to this fight, flight, or freeze response. And so I'm not going to rehash what Dr. Easterbrooks said, but what we know about the brain is that this limbic system, which houses our amygdala and our hippocampus and thalamus and some other brain regions that really help us navigate threat in the world, they can become overactivated. And in particular, one of the things that I don't think Dr. Easterbrook mentioned that's really important in terms of dissecting the problem is, as we talk about the epigenetics movement, is giving us great insight into how stressors of our ancestors impact our stress response. It may create a heightened stress response. So they've done research in this on rats, but they started to look at Holocaust survivors and also look at descendants of slaves and seeing whether their stress response is actually more sensitive because of the trauma that their forefathers or their grandparents have experienced. And so there's been growing support for if you want a resource around this, there's a great book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And it's a funny sounding name, I know, but she does such a good job researching how some of these ideas that we're talking about really work together to inform the people that we see in front of us. But in terms of thinking about this, again, from a larger cultural context, one of the things that is really important to understand is the social contract. So for those who took philosophy in school, I'm going to take you back a little bit and talk about the original social contract. So when we talk about social contract in our country, we're generally talking about what was developed by John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Don't that sound sophisticated? Rousseau. And what they developed, what their philosophy was that the government was in place to protect certain liberties, our pursuit of happiness and our ability to be safe. And this was in place because citizens were willing to give up certain civil rights so the government would be able to do that. But here is the catch. If the government could not fulfill their duty of protecting the citizens could withdraw from this contract and protect themselves. And so when we talk about community and law enforcement and the perception of whether the community that is being policed is also being protected, well, there's a perception that possibly I've experienced, nothing undermines this sense of safety more than trauma. And even if it's trauma at the hands of people within your community, or it's trauma at the hands of someone within your house, whether it's trauma at the hands of the system, it undermines this basic sense of safety, and it really pushes a person to want to protect themselves by any means necessary, even things that fall outside of what we consider mainstream. And part of our ability to connect with our clients, with our patients, is being able to understand that perspective of them wanting to protect themselves and maybe not feeling that they have the same kind of rights in this social contract as others. Now, here's the thing about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma and all these different traumas. There's even racial trauma, where it's the experience of racism and how it impacts a person. The thing about these different traumatic events is that they don't just impact the people who are who have experienced these traumas. They impact the people who have witnessed these traumatic experiences, as well as those who might be descendants of people who have perpetrated these experiences. And what they show up in, you generally as, is biases that we have. So I want to start off by saying biases within themselves are not wrong. They're really just a shortcut to figure out the world, because we take in so much information. I used to live in New York City, and I rode the bus and the train. And my first question always was, what is that smell? And if you ever were in New York, you know what I'm talking about. And the thing is, I couldn't scan every person on the train because I'd probably get arrested. And see, is it coming from here? Is it coming from here? I had to take in information very quickly and make a very quick decision about it. Now, that within itself isn't necessarily wrong, but the problem is when we start to make these broad generalizations, when we start to create these stereotypes, or we have these explicit kinds of biases where we think all people are a certain thing, and it has an adverse impact on them, or it impacts the way that we see them or the world around them. And so being able to understand those biases are so important. Explicit biases are a little easier because it's, someone's saying something about all people that is pretty clear. Implicit bias, though, is the difficult part that we're learning more and more how to deal with. Implicit bias deals with our unconscious beliefs about the world around us and about people around us. And here's the thing about implicit bias. You can have the best intentions and still act on implicit bias, right? Let's say I was in a class and I was, not calling on, I was calling on girls in the class to answer the question, but every time they started to answer the question, they started to stumble a little bit, I jumped right in. But with boys, I let them kind of, stumble their way through it. Well, my intention might be, I don't want her to look embarrassed. I don't want her to, feel like she can't get the answer. But my actual action says, I don't think you're as smart as the boys. I'm not going to let you, go ahead and do. And these are my ideas that are shaping the way that I'm engaging them without even being aware of it. And here's the thing. This doesn't just show up in our one-on-one interactions. It shows up in our policies, right? No, we don't stay open that late. We just don't. That's just the way we do it. Or we, don't go into the community because you are supposed to come in here, right? We have these policies, these rules that are in place that say this is the way it should be, but we don't question why these rules are here in the first place and why we have set up a system that isn't actually sometimes impacting the communities we say we want to serve. And so part of being able to be aware of this is to move past a colorblind society. I mean, part of the research has shown is that when we say that these different aspects of people's identity, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether any of these things, when we say this doesn't have any bearing on any of our decisions, we're really reinforcing some of the things that are already in place. And so it's important to keep those things in mind. If you want to get an idea of your own implicit biases, I encourage you to take the implicit association test. Harvard University, Google it. Harvard University has been running this test for years. You can learn about all the biases you have about women and people of color and immigrants. You'll just feel awful after you take this. No, but you can really check that out. It's a great tool to use. So moving forward, we have a short amount of time, and I do want to get to some of the ways that we can manage some of these things. There's a recent study that came out. It's a study that has been looking at how do we engage the conversation of ACEs. And it's Dr. Ellis and Dr. Diaz at George Washington University who developed this framework called the Building Resilient Community Framework. And pretty much what this framework says is that we need to move from a mental health solely focused model to a public health model to better understand and better utilize our resources for the community. And so what it looks at are what you see here are a lot of the impacts that are community, that are on an individual's experience that shape the way that they navigate the world. And so, of course, discrimination can be a part of that, but also access to resources and poverty. And, of course, we have some of the things that we've grown accustomed to addressing, substance abuse and emotional and sexual abuse. But the key here is that they looked at a series of pediatricians and other healthcare providers and found that they can identify these things, but they don't know what to do about them. And so part of what our goal is, and I think moving forward, and what I'm challenging you to do, is to think about how you're not just addressing kind of this, what you're seeing when the person pops, right? When the toyogram is, showing this traumatic stress reaction of aggression or avoidance, using substances, all these things, and really think about what are some of the driving factors and how do we start to think about them. And so to do this, I want to talk about something called the 3 A's. This is something that my team and I developed at Eye Opening Enterprises. That's a part of our Bridge Trauma-Informed Culturally Responsive curriculum that's for educators. And part of what we understand is that health disparities are rampant throughout our system, both healthcare, whether it's schools, justice, as well as many of this disproportionate contact with disciplinary systems. So, whether it's being expelled or suspended, which is leading to some kind of contact with the justice system and making it so that youth penetrate deeper and deeper in the justice system. These are huge issues. And so I want to talk about 3 things that you can do in your practice to start thinking about how to address some of these issues. The first is acknowledge the role of trauma in increasing disparities and resilience among communities. Now, acknowledge is something that can be really difficult, because what we're talking about really is a concept called cultural humility. Has anyone in here heard of the concept cultural humility? Is some people, some hands going up? All right, good. You guys well educated. I like it. And so when we talk about cultural humility, it's actually a concept that has been developed over time. SAMHSA has really grown and run with it. It's the idea of we can't become proficient or experts in anyone's cultural experience. We have to respond to it. We have to be very open, have an open stance to learning more about it. And part of it is being able to acknowledge the breadth of a traumatic experience. So it's not just the individual trauma, you've witnessed domestic violence, but it's also acknowledging the experience of maybe there's been a history of domestic violence in your family and you feeling like you can't escape that no matter what, and the helplessness that comes with that. It also might be understanding the social context. If I call the police, they might think I'm the one doing it as opposed to the person I'm calling the police on. And so acknowledging those experiences. And so that's one thing in terms of being able to acknowledge the experience of others. But here's the other piece, and this is probably the more difficult part, is acknowledging your own experience. So much of the work I do with this Bridge Ticker program is focusing on teachers thinking about how their racial identity, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, how all these things shape the way that they see the world in ways that they know and don't know. And this takes some time. This takes some processing. This takes some reflection. And so being able to acknowledge that you have a racial identity, that you have a cultural identity, you have gender identity, all these different things that inform the way you see the world. And we are not blank slates. I know we're taught to do that. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And I know we're taught to be kind of blank slates in our therapeutic settings. But in actuality, we're not. We tell them something as soon as we walk in the room. Are we wearing a ring or are we not? Are we tall? Are we, a man? Are we a woman? Or what's our color? There's things that they're making assumptions about. It's just about how much we're telling them at any given moment. And us being aware of how that shows up in these settings is really important for understanding how we connect with these communities. And so that's the first A, to acknowledge. And one thing to help you with that, we have a resource at NCTSN that we just developed. I encourage you to go look at it. It's called Racial Injustice and within the African American community and trauma, racial injustice and trauma. And it specifically was a response to the killings of unarmed black men in America and kind of taking a historical trauma context with it. And just to give you some context, for people who aren't familiar with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, we are one of the biggest trauma stress networks or organizations in the world. We have over 80-some sites, with one being here as well. And we've only done 2 position statements. And the first position statement was the very provocative topic of evidence-based practices. we decided something easy like racial injustice for the second one. But this talks about how important we're seeing this as inextricable from us understanding trauma, particularly within marginalized communities, is being able to acknowledge the role of racial injustice and historical trauma. The second one is to ask questions and collect data about the impact of trauma and best practices for promoting health. One of the things that has been really unfortunate, and excuse the question mark, he was drinking this morning. So one of the things that was one of the things that I think is so important is for us to have data to support why we're making the decisions we're making. And sometimes we're afraid to ask these type of questions. And so part of what we have to understand is that we have to think of ways of inserting these types of questions into our intakes, right? How has, being, a Muslim impacted your experience here at our service center, in our community? How has, being, a person who's within the LGBTQ community, how's that impacted the way that you have decided to engage and who you have decided to engage? And so being able to insert these questions both in our clinical work as well as in our intake processes, but then also really trying to target it in ways of understanding how health disparities are really promulgated within our community. There's a great organization called the Burns Institute, and what they focus specifically on are racial and ethnic disparities. And the reason why they're so different is because they will look at service provision by zip code, ethnicity, as well as kind of other demographic markers, so that they can really hone in on who is really at most risk for some of these issues and who might actually be using the services, so there's a clearer picture around these things. Another resource I'll recommend to you, we just finished a resource at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network called the Race and Trauma in the Classroom resource. And the reason why this is great is it talks about some of the stuff I'm talking about, but more specifically, it talks about creating safe and brave environments. And I want to really highlight that point for you, because so many times in our conversations, we're talking about we need to make people feel safe. We need to make them, feel like it's okay to have these conversations. And yes, that is good. But if that's your only priority, and that's your priority above having an authentic or honest conversation, then you're not going to really push on the topics that you're looking at. And so a brave conversation is the added component of being willing to sit and being uncomfortable for a little while and saying, I don't know what to say here. I need to ask a question. I need to kind of get an idea, and I need to say that I don't know and be willing to really deal with that. And so that's another thing. And the last thing is to adjust your services. It doesn't matter what you collect or what you acknowledge if nothing actually changes for the people on the ground. And so you don't have to give them a massage. But what you should do is you really should be thinking about, how am I connecting with the community? Cultural brokering. How do I really go about being able to support these people? And we've seen this in a number of our communities. I'll tell one quick story. We had a community that was in Boston, and they had a Somali they were working with a Somali community, and they had a trauma-informed program within the school system. No one was coming. Why? Because it was called a trauma-informed program. And so they connected with someone in the Somali community, trained them on what they were trying to do, and that Somali member, this cultural brokering, helped them reshape it to focus on, we're helping your kind of academic outcomes so that you can really deal with problems that get in the way. And from that, they didn't have enough clinicians to take in the people who wanted this type of support. So in closing, I want to end by leaving you with this quote, because I think this speaks to what our mission is as clinicians and thinking outside the box. Viktor Frankl, for those who aren't familiar, is one of my favorite books, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about what it takes to survive the worst life situations. He was a psychiatrist in a Holocaust camp. And here's what he said: those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. We have to know the why of the people we serve if we're to help them deal with any how in their life. And so that's what I challenge you to do, is to really acknowledge what's going on with them, ask the right questions, and then finally adjust what we're doing to be able to help them get through any how. Thank you. Some contact information up there and some references if you would like to stay in contact.
I just want to thank Dr. Pickens again for making the long commute over here. No, we really, really appreciate you coming. And now it is my joy to tell you it's lunchtime.